Bonjour à tous. Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Ransford, the Prisk Gallery Executive. I'm moderator today, and I'm sort of waving down at the people who can't see me past this monitor here. We'll start very shortly with prayer from Elder Claudette Commander of the Algonquin Nation, and then we'll get into opening statements. Then we'll get to the four reporters in the room right now, and then to the phones. We're hoping to wrap this up by about 2:30. This is the Government of Canada, Assembly of First Nations, Chiefs of Ontario, Anishinaabe Nation, and the Council for the Mushuam and Trout class actions to provide an update on the negotiations related to the compensation and long-term reform of First Nations Child and Family Services. And speaking today, we have Patty Hajdu, Minister of Indigenous Services, Mark Miller, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, David Lametti, Minister of Justice, Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse of the AFN, Grand Chief Joel Abram of the Chiefs of Ontario, Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse of the Anishinaabe Nation, Robert Kugler, David Stearns, and Joelle Walker. They are the councils for the Mushuam and Trout class actions, and Elder Claudette Commander, who is virtually on our screen very shortly to begin the prayer, if you would. Elder. Are you on mute, Ms. Commander?
Well, I thought I was unmuted. Now I am. So let me begin again by saying, Kwe kakina, kwe. Miigwech kibija ego ma Anishinaabe kiyo mama weneniwa bijajig. I bring greetings on behalf of the Algonquin Nation, and I wish each and every one of you beautiful people Happy New Year. May this new year be filled with health, happiness, peace, to continue the good work that is so much needed for First Nations children and families, and to build this healing that we need from Canadians to Indigenous peoples. So I say, Chimiigwech, thank you for being here. I welcome you into the territory of my people, and I acknowledge my ancestors, Nijen Wendaganak, O Mama Winaniwag. I acknowledge the ancestors of all Indigenous peoples, First Nations people. I acknowledge everyone's ancestors. And let's acknowledge together with heart, with spirit, with voice, with kindness and love, the children. We are here today for First Nations children. We are here today for First Nations families. Let us ask the Creator to bless us as we embark on this important work for First Nations children. Miigwech gishiminado, miigwech onje kakina. Miigwech gishiminado onje kizagi yediwin, miigwech. Miigwech jojo aki, miigwech kokomistipagizis, miigwech mishomiskizis. And Creator, when we come together with that one mind, one heart, one spirit, and then one voice, we thank you, miigwech onje kakina. I thank you for everyone, miigwech onje, for everything that you have blessed us with. We know, Creator, when we come together, we must always acknowledge that first mother, our mother, the earth. We must always acknowledge that first grandmother and that first grandfather that you have blessed us with, our grandmother, the moon, and our grandfather, the sun, and all our ancestors, Nijen Wendaganag, Kishiminado, ni buksendam onje kakina, nongom ni buksendam mashkawiziwin, ni buksendam mino, bimadzuin, ni buksendam chimino tagzuin. Miigwech kishiminado onje kiniwin emiyawin. Creator, we thank you for bringing us together. We thank you, Creator, for the prayer that is said. We thank you, Creator, for hearing our prayer. We thank you, Creator, as we lift our hearts and our spirits and our heart as one for the children. Continue to remember the children. Continue to bless the children. And we ask you, Creator, to hold us in your love, to give us that strength that our eyes, our minds, our hearts, and our spirit are open to see, to understand, and to always remember those that have been before us that told us to always remember the little ones, the children. And we acknowledge our ancestors, those, as the late Elmer Corshane always held the children so close in his heart, as we acknowledge and remember our elder, the late William Commanda, those grandfathers that always said, remember the little ones. And Creator, we thank you for bringing us together. And Creator, my prayer are for all the leaders who have done good work for the children. Continue to bless them with mashkawiziwin. Continue to bless them with akodeduwin, that courage. And we will do this together for the children. Chimigwej onje kiniwin emiyawin. And I thank you, Creator, for hearing our prayer. Miigwej. Thank you.
So, Minister Hajdu, if you'd begin, please.
Thank you. Kwekwe, hello, bonjour. Such an honor to be with you today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. And thank you to Elder Commanda, who I've had the privilege of knowing for many years, for that good opening and the reminder to keep the little ones at the center of everything we do. Such an important point, and really the focus of our announcement today. I'm also really honored to be here with many partners, including AFN Regional Chief Woodhouse beside me, Chiefs of Ontario Grand Chief Joel Abram, Anishinaabe Nation Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse, Robert Kugler, David Stearns, and Joelle Walker, representing the Mushuman and Trout class actions, and of course my colleagues Minister Miller and Minister Lametti. Before we get into today's announcement, however, I do want to speak briefly about the COVID situation and latest outbreaks that are impacting Indigenous communities across the country. I first want to thank the many Indigenous leaders and communities that have been working together so diligently over the last 2 years to protect each other through the various waves of this pandemic. But the highly infectious Omicron variant is again presenting significant risk to many communities, and the number of people who are sick or who are isolating is rising. And not only are people's health and wellness threatened, but of course community services and the functioning of communities and those who can provide those services are stretched thin. My office and Indigenous Services Canada officials are in daily contact with community leadership and partners, not just to get updates, but also to confirm needed supports and put them in place. For example, in the case of Bearskin Lake First Nation, I've spoken personally with Chief Kaminawadaman, as well as Grand Chief Derek Fox of Anishinaabe Nation, to check in, to confirm that the supports they've requested are arriving and are provided, and to make sure that we will continue to be there for the community in the way that they determine is the most helpful. In the case of Bearskin Lake, in addition to COVID-19 supports of almost $4 million since the beginning of March 2020, we've recently approved 2 additional funding allotments totaling about $900,000, and this is within days of receiving requests from the community. The funding will provide things like food security, PPE, local community COVID workers, perimeter security, essential supplies, and of course, wood cutting and collection that's needed to heat homes. We are also working with a variety of other communities across the country, and the department is preparing to support increasing numbers of affected communities, and will continue to be there for Indigenous communities to meet the needs as they determine as the most helpful. I do want to also take this moment to thank the many dedicated professionals, healthcare professionals, and community members who are going above and beyond their regular duties to ensure that their colleagues, their neighbors, and indeed communities are fully supported during these exceptional times. We see you, we know just how enormous these efforts are, and we're very grateful. I will remind everyone that one way that we can all be useful to help bring down the number of people who become seriously ill with COVID-19 and to protect community functioning is to ensure that we are all as fully vaccinated as we are eligible, to support people who are unimmunized or partially immunized or have not yet been able to receive a booster shot. Vaccination is indeed saving lives. It is also helping to reduce the strain on our healthcare systems. So turning now to today's announcement, I'm very pleased to announce that Canada and the parties have reached 2 significant agreements in principle. One that provides fair and equitable compensation to First Nations children and families harmed by discriminatory underfunding, and the other addressing the long-term reform that's needed for the First Nations Child and Family Services Program. I want to thank the parties that have worked all so hard and together. As I mentioned earlier, the Assembly of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, Chiefs of Ontario, Anishinaabe Nation, and Mashum Trout, as well as our own teams at Indigenous Services Canada and Justice Canada for staying at the table and working through these important and historic negotiations. So before speaking further, I'll turn it over to our other speakers today, starting with AFN Regional Chief Cindy Woodhouse.
Thank you, Minister. Good afternoon to each and every one of you. For some of you that don't know me, my name is Cindy Woodhouse, and I'm the Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for the Manitoba region. And I am chair of the Assembly of First Nations AFN Special Committee on Seeking Justice for Discrimination Against Our Children in this matter. I come from a small community in Manitoba. It's called Penemutang. I was raised there with my mom and dad and my grandmothers and my whole family, and I'm thankful for that. But many children, sadly, were taken from our people. And they shouldn't have. And I'm glad to be here today to speak about that. Kichimigwech, Elder Commander, Chimigwech, for your prayers this morning, for our children, for our little ones, and for your constant love for our people. I want to thank you for that. I also want to thank Minister Hajdu, for inviting me today to be with you here at this very important announcement. And I want to acknowledge Minister Lametti for being here virtually. I also want to thank my colleagues, Anishinaabe Nation Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse, for his work. You know, he was very instrumental in, in making sure that we don't forget the remote communities in all of this. And to Grand Chief Joel Abram for your support and over the past weeks and the past few months, a lot of, and of course our lawyers and our staff, and, people haven't had a Christmas yet, we've been working around the clock, and I want to thank all of you for that. I know it's been a long time. And yeah, I also want to thank the work of our former national chiefs. We've been working at this a long time. Former National Chiefs Perry Bellegarde, Phil Fontaine, Sean Atleo, and, former National Chief Ovid McCurdy and many others. And also to our current National Chief, Roseanne Archibald, and the entire Executive Committee, Ontario Regional Chief Glenn Hare, and Saskatchewan Chief Bobby Cameron, and one of our other colleagues, Norm Yaklaya, who worked very hard on this, And I also want to commend Dr. Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada for their commitment to this work. This historic settlement of $40 billion has been a long time coming. First Nations from across Canada have had to work very hard for this day to provide redress for monumental wrongs against First Nation children. Wrongs fueled by an inherently biased system. The Assembly of First Nations has been pressing this issue for more than 30 years, including strong advocacy by First Nations, rights holders, and families. Persistence of the Assembly of First Nations in human rights proceedings, in the courts, and now at the negotiation table. A human rights complaint launched in 2007, and our win at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And every effort to forge a path to end discrimination against First Nation children and families in the federal child welfare program to ensure that it never happens again. Discriminatory funding under the federal First Nations Child and Family Services programs and other decisions has led to a massive overrepresentation of First Nations children into the child welfare system in every province and territory in this country. Every day for decades, First Nations children, some even newborns, have been ripped from their families and communities, and many denied medical services and other supports when they've needed them. All at the hands of a federal child welfare program that should have protected them. More than 200,000 children and families are impacted by this compensation agreement. This wasn't and isn't about parenting, it's in fact about poverty. And First Nations children being removed from their families and communities instead of being provided help with food, clothing, or shelter. The federal child welfare program was broken from the start. Most Canadians do not know this, that there was actually an incentive for child welfare agencies to remove children. In fact, a First Nations child welfare agency would not receive funding unless the child was removed from their home and placed into foster care. And until recently, the federal government's narrow implementation of Jordan's Principle resulted in First Nations children being denied medical and other services, in some cases forced parents to place their children into care. We have a long way to go to address the poverty in our nations, and no amount of money will ever be the right amount, nor will it bring back a childhood lost. But today is about acknowledgement, about being seen and heard. Today is about a plan for the future, with First Nations defining and determining a path forward, grounded in our rights and the common goal to have our children succeed. Today is about achieving for First Nations and for our country. At the AFN, our efforts have been and will continue to be about removing barriers that keep our kids down, creating a new process that will allow our kids to thrive and reach their full potential with strong connections to their languages, cultures, nations, and to their families. I have a message for 3 groups of people today. To the tens of thousands of First Nations children who were removed from their families, their nations, and their cultures. 2, First Nations children and families in communities today who are still dealing with a broken system. And finally, to Canadians who may not realize that these harmful, discriminatory practices were and are still taking place. First, to the children and the families who have been impacted by the Federal Child and Family Services Program, and to those who've impacted by a narrow implementation of Jordan's Principle. I acknowledge your pain and your loss, the loss of time, and family life with your siblings. I'm sorry you didn't have that. Your parents, your aunties, and your elders. You are heard. You are seen. Compensation and reform will not bring that time back to you, but it is my hope that it will change the course of our families and communities starting today. Secondly, to the First Nations children and families who are still tangled in this system, the Assembly of First Nations will be working with the experts, including those with lived experiences, to make sure that we make change that can be seen, felt, and measured. And finally, I want to speak to Canadians. In the past 12 months, you have walked with us with the discovery of unmarked graves at sites of former residential schools. You're learning things my people have known and have lived. The children lost at residential schools and the many survivors are the ancestors of the children experiencing similar harms today, including those of the 60s scoop, day school survivors, and now this. More than 200,000 First Nations children and youth who were removed from their homes and nations or denied services under Jordan's Principle could be eligible for compensation. And all of our children and communities going forward will benefit from the $19.8 billion in new investments and First Nation design program and services to deal with the root causes of family breakdown, like substandard housing, poverty, substance abuse, and multi-generational trauma. Over the coming months, the AFN and the Government of Canada will determine a full compensation package in a final settlement agreement. The final settlement agreement will contain provisions on eligibility for compensation and the application process. Work towards long-term reform will include AFN-facilitated engagement sessions with all regions. Engagement with First Nations will guide our negotiations with the federal government to ensure the reform program is relevant and responsive to the needs of First Nations children and families across the country. I'm very proud to have been at the negotiating table for the Assembly of First Nations, Today is a culmination of, again, more than 30 years of hard work and advocacy grounded in First Nations rights, fairness, and equity for our children and their families. We've delivered, and I'm so very proud of our efforts and what this will mean for our people. I acknowledge the hard work and the dedications of the rights holders at the table, and Senator Murray Sinclair for chairing the negotiations that helped us reach these historic agreements in principle. I also acknowledge the work and commitments of Ministers Mark Miller and Minister Patty Hajdu, and all of your officials, as well as the support of Prime Minister Trudeau. I want to thank you, Prime Minister, for taking this very seriously and making sure that this had happened and that we didn't end up, where we don't want to be. And I thank him for that. And we will hold you all to this path. Yeah, I am confident and I am optimistic that we are on a path that will support First Nations children have a life and every opportunity that every single one of them deserves. Chimigwech, thank you.
Next, we have Chiefs of Ontario Grand Chief Joel Abram.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the elder for her opening prayer, opening us up in a good way, and also for the comments of Regional Chief Woodhouse. And thank you for leading the discussion. This agreement in principle will initiate long-term reforms that ensure First Nations that culturally appropriate supports and prevention services are available to families. It'll also increase funding available for First Nation representative services and will provide culturally grounded protection approaches and prevention approaches that allow First Nations youth to remain connected to their language and culture and safely within their homes and their communities. And today's announcement brings us one step closer to addressing discrimination in child welfare and achieving substantive equality for First Nations children. It also marks the beginning of an important journey to ensure all First Nations have a solid foundation for moving forward and improving the quality of life for future generations. On behalf of the Ontario Leadership Council, we call upon the Government of Canada and all Canadians to see this through. I'd also like to thank the survivors and their families for their bravery in sharing their lived experiences and stories. And we will stand with you and continue to ensure your voices are heard and honored. Also, thank you to Cindy Blackstock, who a lot of this would not have happened without her intervention in the First Nations Child Family Caring Society and beginning the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal Challenge, and resulting in a lot of the orders that have led to the path where we are today. And so, it's all about making sure that, there's no overrepresentation of First Nations children in the welfare system going into the future, and also in the past of righting some of the wrongs that have done. And we can't forget that, this happened because of discrimination. And we still have a lot of work to do in tackling the root causes of this discrimination. And I've talked with Minister Lametti on this several times, which is about the impact of the doctrine of discovery on Indigenous people in North America, and how we have to begin to move past that, in order to really dig at the roots of colonialism and the paternalism that came along with that so negatively impacted Indigenous families, not only in Canada, throughout the United States as well. And I've often said that the child welfare is the new residential schools in terms of impact on First Nations families and children. And it's time that we begin to turn that tide. And I think today is a very good step on doing that. And Canada living up to, settling down and coming up with this agreement. And there's still some work to do, in the future, a lot of hard work to get where we need to be at the end of the day. But again, I'm very thankful that we are where we are today. And it's part of my culture as well, is to make sure that we're thankful for the things that we have. And so I'm very thankful today for this agreement principle. And I'm willing to roll up. We're going to be rolling up our sleeves to move forward to ensure that this agreement comes to a final disposition. And then we can get to the hard work of changing the face of child welfare and making up for past wrongs and just moving forward together on a good foot. And also, getting back to the original relationship which in our culture is based on through wampum, where our Canada's in their canoe with their laws and their people and their customs, and we're traveling down a river of life parallel, with First Nations people in our canoes with their laws and our children. And so again, this is also about recognizing and ensuring that First Nation jurisdiction of their children is respected, and making sure that overrepresentation in child welfare goes down. And it's not just about child welfare; it's about lack of clean drinking water. It's about lack of housing. It's about a dozen different areas where discrimination is happening. So I'm glad that housing is a little bit a part of this agreement, and other things as well. So I'm just really looking forward to moving forward to do better for our Indigenous people across Canada. And so again, I'd like to thank everyone, all our team in Ontario, for their hard work, the technical folks, legal, everyone that came together to make this happen, and also the efforts of Canada and all the other parties that were involved in. So again, I'd like to thank you all for your input into this and coming together. So on behalf of our children and the faces yet to come, this is a great step. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief Joel Abram. And now I'll turn to Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse for a few words from Anishinaabe Nation.
Bonjour and Wachier. Good afternoon. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging the prayer from Elder Commanda. Also, I'm joining you today from the offices of Anishinaabe Nation here in Thunder Bay, in the traditional territory of the Fort William First Nation. The Ojibways on the western shores of Lake Superior, and signatories to the Robinson Treaty area of 1850. I apologize that I cannot be with you all in Ottawa, but I acknowledge the peoples and lands on which that you are communicating to us from, which is the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So I bring greetings from Anishinaabe Nation, the territory from Treaty 9 and Treaty 5 communities within the province of Ontario. Our territory occupies 2/3 of the province, and as you would see, our area is very vast, and many of our communities are remote. We have 34 communities that are fly-in, but still our road access communities has various degrees of remoteness. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Bearskin First Nation and all of our communities that are dealing with the current COVID-19 pandemic. Today, I was informed that there's close to 10 communities now within Anishinaabe Nation that is affected by this COVID-19 pandemic. These are some of the challenges that we bring, that we want to give light to this process, this AIP process, and the work that we've been doing with all partners to really bring light the real challenges of our remote communities, of our First Nation communities within Anishinaabe Nation. Recently, I spoke with visitors of Kingfisher Lake First Nation, one of our 39 First Nation communities that Anishinaabe Nation represents. Grocery deliveries to the community store has not come in. The shelves were bare most of the week due to freight delays. That's life in the north, the remote north. When I go to a northern store in any of our First Nation communities, you would be shocked at what we have to pay for an apple, for chicken soup, for vitamin C, or healthy vegetables, if we can even get them within our communities. So how are we supposed to combat COVID-19 and also bring these resources to our children when our community stores can't even put these on the shelves? That's life in the remote north. Sandy Lake, one of our remote communities, a 4-year-old named Brody Meekus passed away from strep throat because he was sent home with Tylenol. There's no antibiotics in the community at that time. That, ladies and gentlemen, is life in the north. And these are the same challenges faced by remote communities across the country. I've been getting calls from various chiefs across this country saying that yes, we are facing the same challenges that access and lack of infrastructure and lack of capital within our communities, which still perpetuates the discrimination against our children. So that is life in the North. All these areas, these challenges that we face add to our youth suicide rate, our opioid crises, the realities of intergenerational trauma that are interconnected. Tragically, these experiences are not uncommon in our First Nation communities. They scar our children, our youth, and our families every single day. For our remote communities, empirical, math-based solutions to these problems have been unheard of. I'm proud that we have finally identified a promising way forward in this agreement in principle through meaningful structural change. You will agree that $1 in Toronto is different than $1 in Attawapiskat. So these are areas that we also want to focus within our participation in this AIP. Through the creation and support for the National Assembly of Remote Communities, we have created a collective voice for remote communities across the country. And through a remoteness secretariat to collect and study data on issues of remoteness affecting our communities, we can finally put the realities of life in the North and the challenges of our community space on the map in a meaningful, right way across the country. For the first time, I'm very encouraged to say that this deal puts us on a path to quantifying and indexing remoteness on a national scale. For the first time, math and science will dictate the numbers. This is what it costs to deliver child and family services in our communities. This is what it's going to cost to keep professionals in our communities, to service our children, our youth and families. This is what it's actually going to cost to end the discrimination within our remote communities. I'm therefore pleased and honored to have signed this agreement in principle on behalf of our First Nations at Anishinaabe Nation. We have joined with leadership from other remote communities across the country to break new ground on overcoming the barriers we face by establishing structural reforms specifically directed at our remoteness. I'm especially pleased that our Choose Life program, Choose Life, that provides essential suicide prevention supports for our youth, will be enhanced through long-term reform and sustainable funding and will be extended across the country. I really thank also Minister Hajdu and Minister Miller and your team as well for working with our team at Anishinaabe Nation to ensure that these areas of access and remoteness are included in this AIP. And we have a long way to go, but I think I'm very encouraged that, in terms of moving ahead together, we will deal with and overcome these challenges that I have. As I conclude, I'd like to say a heartfelt miigwech to the leaders and members of all the negotiating team that's been happening for the past couple of months. I acknowledge the significant contributions of Assembly First Nations, specifically Regional Chief Woodhouse. Thank you for your support and also your guidance in this work as well. The Chiefs of Ontario, Grand Chief Abram, and your important work that you bring to the table as well, and your expertise. And also the newly established National Assembly of Remote Communities, the NARC. We're looking forward to working together to really bring solutions and community-based solutions to remoteness challenges. And of course, also to the Caring Society and Cindy Blackstock to reach this landmark agreement with our federal treaty partner. And I would especially like to thank Honorable Murray Sinclair for sharing his guidance and wisdom while facilitating these negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, chiefs, everyone, what we have accomplished here together, we have done in a good way. Today is a good day for the people of Anishinaabe Nation. I know we are still under the shroud of COVID-19 and dealing with this pandemic in our north, but these are ways in which we'll have meaningful discussions and meaningful dialogue and meaningful negotiations to really address the challenges of our people within the north and also to nations across the country. Miigwech, thank you very much. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you so much, Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse. And now I'll turn to Robert Kugler, David Stearns, and Joelle Walker for some words in their representation of the Mashum and Trout class actions.
Yes, thank you. My name is David Stearns. I'll be speaking on behalf of the group. If there are any questions in French, my colleague Robert Kugler will answer them. Good afternoon, everyone. Miigwech. I'd like to thank the elder for her opening prayer and acknowledge the attendance of Regional Chief Woodhouse, Grand Chief Abram, Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse, the ministers of the Crown, and would also like to thank the ministers for inviting us to this press conference. As I said, my name is David Stearns. I'm with the firm Sotos LLP in Toronto. I'm joined by Robert Kugler of the law firm Kugler Candiston, based in the province of Quebec, and Joel Walker of the law firm Miller Tiddley in British Columbia. We act for the plaintiffs in two class actions brought on behalf of First Nations youth and their caregivers. We're also working in close collaboration with Council for the Assembly of First Nations and their representative plaintiffs, and have also worked in collaboration with and benefited greatly from the expertise and assistance of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, led by Dr. Cindy Blackstock and their counsel. This case followed on a landmark decision of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. It's a decision which I hope children in all the schools in Canada will eventually be taught about and will learn about the way that American children learn about Brown versus Board of Education in the United States. It is that significant a decision, and it played a tremendous role in the class action that we brought and in the historic settlement that has been reached. The historic settlement reached on Friday will result in $20 billion in compensation being paid to the following three groups of individuals. First, First Nations children who were living on reserves or in the Yukon and who were taken from their homes and placed in state care at any time from 1991 until the present. Second, First Nations children in Canada, whether living on or off reserve, who were deprived of essential services or who experienced delays in receiving essential services from a government, whether it be the provincial or the federal government. This subclass goes from 1991 to 2017. Third, certain of the family caregivers of these children. I want to begin, though, by speaking through you, the media, to the children and the young adults who are in this class action. This case is for you. This settlement is for you. This settlement will provide some compensation to you for your suffering. We know it is very important to you, and we know that you have questions such as, am I in the class? Where do I sign up? How do I get information? And importantly, when will I receive compensation? In an effort to answer some of these questions, we have prepared a list of answers to frequently asked questions in English and French, and we will provide the link, and we will ask the media to share that link so that children and young adults and their caregivers can get the best information, the most timely information that we have. Some of these questions we don't have the complete answers to yet, but we will want to try to get as much information to you as we can at the earliest time. Let me also say that in order to receive information, the best thing that you can do is to register on our firm's website, which is, and it's the same in English and French, www.sotosclassactions.com, and go to First Nations case. And that is a bilingual website, but the URL is the same in English and French. Even if you are not sure if you qualify, please register. It's quick, you sign up, and as information becomes available, we will send it to you. We're also more than happy to answer your inquiries, but we do ask that you be patient as there are a number of people that we are trying to reach. We will respond to you. This settlement is the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, and it is believed to be one of the largest anywhere in the world. It is important to point out that all of the $20 billion of this settlement will go to the class members. The costs of administering the settlement and legal fees will be paid over and above this amount once determined and once approved by the court. The enormity of this settlement is due to one reason and one reason only, and that is the sheer size and scope of the harm that was inflicted on the class members as a result of a cruel and discriminatory First Nations family and child welfare system that Canada has now finally taken major steps to overhaul. It is our sincere hope that this money will provide some comfort to each member of the class and help them with the difficult process of rebuilding their lives. I would like to say a special mention to the representative plaintiffs. In a class action, certain people known as the representative plaintiffs put their name forward and put their stories forward in a statement of claim so that the claim can be brought before the court on behalf of a much larger group, in this case, a group consisting of hundreds of thousands of people. And I'd like to say a special word about the young man whose name is attached to this historic case, Xavier Mouchoum in English. Xavier trusted us to tell his story in the hope that this lawsuit would help change a discriminatory system and provide financial support to the children who suffered under it. Xavier was born into the Anishinaabe Nation in Lac-Simon, Quebec. When he was 9 years old, he was removed from his family for reasons which he still does not know and placed into foster care. From the age of 9 until 18, Xavier was transferred to 14 different foster homes. He was placed and he was removed from 14 different foster homes. He lost his native Algonquin language, his culture, and his ties to the Lac-Simon community. At the age of 18, Xavier was forced to leave his foster family and fend for himself because Canada did not fund at the time post-majority services for First Nations individuals. It has been found by the tribunal in the decision which I mentioned that the child welfare system that was behind the removal of Xavier, his brother, tens of thousands of other First Nations youth like him, was a system organized around discrimination and colonial views about First Nations families and youth. In fact, as Regional Chief Woodhouse mentioned, it was the policy of the Canadian government that removal of First Nations children living on reserves from their homes ought to be a first resort for any child in need of assistance, as opposed to a last resort. That is the opposite of how child welfare is supposed to work, and in fact, how it does work for children who are not living on reserves. The discriminatory removal resulted in an epidemic of foster care, also referred to sometimes as the Millennium Scoop. As found by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, more First Nations children were living in foster care than were living in residential schools at their height. Another young man who has led this cause is Jeremy Miwasige, Meawasige. Jeremy is a member of the Pictou Landing First Nation in Nova Scotia. He was born in 1994 and has suffered from multiple disabilities and high care needs throughout his life. Jeremy was deprived of essential services because of jurisdictional disputes among governments and government departments. Together with his brother and litigation guardian, Jonathan, and their late mother, Marina Beatles, Jeremy has been a champion in the fight against discrimination, fight against discriminatory government policies that breach their constitutional equality rights in what is now known as Jordan's Principle. I referred at the beginning to two class action lawsuits. The first one, the Mouchoum class action I've mentioned. The second lawsuit was brought to address children and families impacted by Jordan's Principle prior to 2007. The representative plaintiff in that case is the father of two children who suffered grievously from a system and from governments who focused on jurisdiction and petty interdepartmental disputes rather than the medical needs of children. Zach Trout from the Cross Lake First Nation in Manitoba is the father of his late daughter and son named Sane and Jacob, who died at a young age from Batten disease. Zach's children were deprived of basic medical necessities during their short lives. For years, Zach and his wife were forced to reuse needles and feeding tubes because these necessities fell into service gaps. He and his children and his wife suffered for years under a cruel government policy. There are a number of other representative plaintiffs who have equally compelling stories and who have courageously come forward to allow us to bring this action. I will not name them all. Their names can be found on the consolidated statement of claim found on our website, www.sotosclassactions.com. Our goals in bringing these class actions were twofold. We wanted to ensure that individuals who had suffered significant harm under the discriminatory child welfare system or were denied or delayed essential services received by non-First Nations children, like Zebi Bashub, Jeremy Mizwahi, I beg your pardon, and the late Sine and Jacob Trout, receive compensation that reflects the harm that they each suffered as a result of that discrimination. For Xavier and the children who were removed and experienced the life-altering trauma of extended displacement from home and community, any settlement had to offer them far more than the maximum of $40,000 per individual awarded by the tribunal in its 2019 compensation decision. We also wanted to significantly expand the group of individuals entitled to receive compensation. The CHRT decision awards compensation going back only to 2006, whereas this class action goes back to 1991, and compensation under this settlement will be paid to individuals who suffered discrimination going back all the way to 1991. With this historic settlement, we've accomplished both of these goals. Those who are the most affected by discriminatory conduct will receive significantly more than $40,000 in compensation. And class members who were removed from their homes or were denied their equality rights under Jordan's principle going back to 1991 will be compensated. When we entered into settlement discussions, we said we wanted to arrive at a settlement that Canadians could be proud of. This is such a settlement. Informed Canadians who understand the degree of suffering and harm will be proud of this settlement. There are many details to be worked out before we can begin distributing funds to class members. Over the next several months, we will be consulting with experts, First Nations communities, the Assembly of First Nations, and the First Nations Family and Child Caring Society to ensure that the distribution of funds is carried out efficiently and in a manner that is culturally sensitive and that recognizes the youth and the vulnerability of many members of this class. We are also aware of lessons learned from previous settlements, such as the Indian Residential School settlement, and are committed to ensuring that the settlement structure and distribution will reflect those lessons. Once we've determined how the funds will be distributed, we will seek approval of the entire settlement and the distribution plan from the federal court and begin to distribute money to class members. And we hope that we can accomplish all of this and begin distribution within this calendar year. Once again, thank you to the ministers for inviting us to this press conference. And those are our remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Stearns, and also thank you for highlighting just how devastating this legacy of discrimination has been using some very specific cases. Thank you. And I think it really highlights that no amount of compensation can make up for the traumas that First Nations children, families, and communities have experienced. But this will begin the process of healing, and it will support families on that journey of healing. It will support individuals who have experienced extraordinary loss and harm. It will stop the discrimination, and it will support First Nations-led long-term reform. These agreements in principle amount to a total of about $40 billion. Approximately $20 billion will be provided in compensation for First Nations children on reserve and in the Yukon who were removed from their homes and their parents or caregivers due to discriminatory underfunding of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program. This also includes those who were impacted by the government's narrow definition of Jordan's Principle. Our shared goal is to reach that final settlement agreement, those final settlement agreements as soon as possible so that compensation can be delivered quickly and fairly. Approximately $20 billion over the next 5 years will be invested to reform the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and begin the work to reform Jordan's Principle and other departmental initiatives. Some of these reforms, including preventative measures to keep families and children together, will be implemented as early as April of 2022. Through the Agreement in Principle on Long-Term Reform and Child and Family Services, the system will be reformed by focusing first and foremost on prevention. First Nations and First Nations child and family service providers will be better positioned to address the factors that lead to First Nations children being taken into care. They will have that stable and predictable funding that will help them to keep their children with their families and in communities. The funding includes significant investments in on-reserve housing and other major capital related to the delivery of critical child and family services and Jordan's Principle. Simply, and I think other speakers have said this, poverty cannot be a reason that a child cannot stay with their family. We will continue
to implement Jordan's Principle to make sure that First Nation children can continue to have access to products, services, and supports that they need. We will do it in partnership with First Nations, the provinces, and territories in order to develop approaches that are long-term and that will fill in the gaps and make sure that we reach equality for First Nations children.
Children need to be with their families and their loved ones to thrive. Societies that place their children first are the strongest, most resilient, and most prosperous. This new path puts First Nations children first to help them thrive and grow, surrounded by their cultures and their loved ones. It provides a new path for community wellness and success. It is an investment in the future of our country. Now that Canada and the parties have signed these agreements in principle, we'll focus on finalizing the settlement agreements, and we look forward to immediately beginning this work with all of the parties. And as much as I'm pleased to say that we've reached this critical step to end litigation and the underlying discrimination, this is indeed a day for reflection. It's an acknowledgement of the extreme harms and grief that too many families continue to live with each and every day. It's an acknowledgement of a country that knowingly underfunded First Nations communities in care, and it led to compounding and ongoing loss. Canada's decisions and actions harmed First Nations children, families, and communities. Discrimination caused intergenerational harm and loss, and those losses are not reversible. But I believe that healing is possible if we look face on at the harms caused, if we compensate, and most importantly, if we end the discrimination once and for all. The work that we've done together is a huge step towards a future where every First Nations child has a fair chance to succeed and every chance to thrive in their home and their community. We are determined
to move forward with our partners of the First Nations, including those who joined me today for today's announcement. Today's announcement is an important step.
I want to express my gratitude to Honourable Murray Sinclair and his entire team for facilitating this work. His leadership, his immense experience, and his wisdom guided all of us and helped us stay focused on our shared goal of equity and wellness for First Nations children and their families. And to all of the parties again, I'm grateful for all of your contributions, your willingness to sit at the table with Canada, and your dedication to future generations. I'll now turn to Minister Miller. Thank you.
Kwekwe, hello, bonjour. I want to thank Elder Commanda for opening in a good way this historic announcement. Thank you, Minister Hajdu, for giving that overview of the agreements in principle and what it'll mean for First Nations children going forward, as well as the speakers that preceded her and outlined what this means so eloquently. Tels que mentionné, les accords de
As
principe
mentioned,
historiques que nous avons
the
atteints
AIPs that
prévoient un
we've
investissement
reached
total d'environ
plan for
40
an
milliards de
investment of
dollars.
about $40 billion.
Environ 20 milliards de ces fonds
$20 billion
permettront
of these
d'indemniser les
funds
enfants
will
des Premières Nations
compensate
sur
First
réserve
Nation
et au
children
Yukon
on
qui ont été
reserve
enlevés de leur
and
famille
in the
par des
Yukon
agences
that
de
were
services à
removed
l'enfance et à la
by
famille.
their families by
Cela
Child
comprend
Welfare
également les enfants
Services.
qui ont été
This also
touchés par la
includes
définition
children
étroite
who were
du principe de
affected by
Jordan.
the narrow
Notre
application of the
objectif
Jordan
commun
principle.
est de
Our
parvenir à un
common
accord le
goal
plus rapidement
is to
possible
reach
afin
an
que les familles
agreement
puissent être
as quickly as
indemnisées.
possible to
Un
compensate the
autre 20
families.
milliards de dollars sera
Another
également
$20
investi pour
billion
réformer à
will
long
be
terme les
invested
services à
to
l'enfance
have
et à
a
la famille des
long-term
Premières
reform
Nations
of
et du
child and
principe de
family
Jordan à
services
travers le
for
Canada.
First Nations
Certaines de
and
ces réformes, notamment
Jordan's
des mesures
principle across
préventives visant à
Canada.
garder les
Some
enfants
of
et
these
les
measures
familles
include
ensemble
preventive
seront mises en
measures to
œuvre
keep
aussitôt
families
qu'en
together,
avril
and they will be
2022 de cette
implemented
année.
as soon as April
Pour faire écho aux
2022
commentaires
of
de la ministre, nous sommes
this year.
extrêmement
We are
reconnaissants envers toutes les
extremely
parties qui
grateful
se sont
to all
présentées à la
parties
table de
that presented
négociation
themselves at the
et qui sont
negotiations
restées.
table and
Nous
who stayed
remercions
there.
l'Assemblée des Premières
We would like to
Nations,
thank the
la
Assembly of First
Société de
Nations,
soutien à l'enfance et à la famille des
the
Premières Nations,
Caring
les chefs de
Society,
l'Ontario,
the Chiefs of
la Nation
Ontario,
Anishinaabe-Aski et les partis
the
Mushuam Trout pour leur
Anishinaabe
travail et leur
Aski
engagement
Nation and the
commun
Mushuam
à
and
l'égard de ce
Trout
processus.
class actions for their
Je
common
reconnais, nous
work
remercions
on
tout
this process.
particulièrement
I would
également
also like to
l'honorable
thank
Murray Sinclair
the
et son équipe
Honorable
d'avoir fait faciliter
Murray
ces
St. Clair
négociations
and
qui
his
n'étaient
team
pas
for
faciles.
facilitating this
Et nous ne
negotiation that
serions
was
pas
not
ici
easy.
sans vous, Monsieur
We would
Sinclair.
not be here without you, Mr. St. Clair.
Les survivants des pensionnats ont fait de la protection
Residential
de l'enfance
schools
et du principe de
survivors have
leurs
made
principaux appels à
Jordan's
l'action.
principle their main
Nous
call
devons
to
accomplir
action.
le travail qu'ils nous ont demandé
We
de faire
have to accomplish
en nous
the work that they
concentrant sur
asked
la
us to
santé
do. We have
et
to
le bien-être
focus
des
on
enfants,
the
des
health
jeunes et
and
des familles des
well-being
Premières
of the
Nations.
young people
Je crois
and
fermement qu'il
families
n'a
of
pas
First
été dans
Nations.
l'intérêt de qui que ce soit
I don't think
à
it was
régler
in
ces questions par le
anyone's
biais de litiges devant les
interest
tribunaux.
to go to
La
court on these
réconciliation doit se
issues.
reposer sur des relations
Reconciliation has
respectueuses
to
et celles-ci se
be
forment par le dialogue
focused
et des
on
principes
respectful relationships, dialogue.
The survivors of residential schools identified child welfare and Jordan's principle as their top calls to action. We must do the work that they asked us to do by focusing on the health and well-being of First Nations children, youth, and families. Over the last 6 months, I've had the opportunity to visit over a half dozen sites of former residential institutions and speak to many survivors. And while many spoke of their unspeakable, horrific experiences, while others continue to suffer in silence, there was a common feeling and message of hope for the next generation, of hope that we would bring and break the model of removing children from their communities, of ensuring that children are brought up surrounded by their loved ones. Along with the investments that we're currently making in education, today's announcement does fuel that hope. But we must recognize that there is an immense amount of work left to be done. I strongly believe that it's in no one's interest to address these issues through litigation in court. A lot has been achieved in 6 short weeks outside the courts by speaking to each other. This is the largest settlement in Canadian history, but no amount of money can reverse the harms experienced by First Nations children. However, historic injustices require historic reparations. Equally important, the agreement on long-term reform addresses the factors that lead to children being taken into care in the first place and makes sure that First Nations and Child and Family Services agencies have stable and predictable funding to deliver the supports that are essential to keeping children with their families and communities. The agreements in principle we have signed today will support First Nations children so that they can have the same opportunities to grow up with their families and communities, thriving through their cultures and languages. As a next step, and a difficult one, Canada and the parties will negotiate a final settlement agreement, which will map out how compensation will flow to First Nations, children, and families. It will establish a framework for long-term funding to improve services for children and families. Nous savons qu'il y a beaucoup de travail à faire pour s'assurer que
We
les
know there's a
enfants
lot
sont
of work
pleinement
to do to
protégés
make sure
contre
that
toutes les formes de
children are
violence et de
fully
discrimination,
protected against all forms of violence and
conformément à la Déclaration des
discrimination,
Nations
according
Unies
to
sur les droits
the
des peuples
UNDRIP.
autochtones. Nous sommes impatients de poursuivre ce travail en
We are
étroite
eager
collaboration
to
avec nos
continue this
partenaires des
work
Premières
in
Nations.
close collaboration with our partners at First Nations.
The harmful practices that are still in place today can no longer continue. It's Canada's responsibility to right past wrongs and end racism and discrimination against Indigenous children. And to do this, we'll keep putting Indigenous children and youth at the center of all we do so that they can grow up happy, healthy, and in their communities where they belong. And finally, as we reflect on a country that we want to live in, we need to ask ourselves what a healed country looks like. And I don't have the answer to that, but I do believe these agreements, the ones that were reached last week, are a step in that direction. Thank you. Merci, miigwech.
Hi, everyone. It's Chris Rance, the moderator again. We have 5 journalists in the room. We're going to go through the 5, 1 question, 1 follow-up. Then we'll move to the phones. We've got about a half hour for Q&A, so please keep your questions short. And everyone who's answering, please keep your answers tight, please. Go ahead, please, Laurence.
Bonjour, Laurence Martin de Radio
Hello,
Canada.
this is Laurence Martin from Radio Canada. My question is for Mr. Miller. In terms of compensation, I understand that we don't know the details yet. The Human Rights Tribunal said it was about $40,000 per child. You said that you would like to have some variability according to the harm that was experienced. Is $40,000 the minimum for you? Answer, this is the commitment I made, especially for children that were removed from their community. This commitment stands, as said Mr. Stern. There are many details that still need to be detailed, and it includes more than just the decision from the Human Rights Tribunal. So this information is to come and will be part of the discussions that we'll have and is part of the commitment that we've made to Dr. Blackstock. Thank you. You also talked about reforming the system, the child welfare program, to have initiatives to make sure that Indigenous children can stay with their families. Can you give us concrete examples of initiatives and programs that could be funded to make sure that children stay with their families? Answer. As it is mentioned in the AIP, as part of as soon as April 2022, we will be enacting prevention programs. Everything depends on the community. There are many modalities depending on the community. There are even leisure activities, sports that will be funded. This broken system was forcing us to intervene rather than to prevent. And of course, prevention is less attractive, but it is so important. And we're trying to avoid intervention, so there can be all sorts of activities. This can include reforming the Jordan's Principle. Many communities have asked us for support to, instead of intervening to prevent. So it really all depends on the community. But what we heard loud and clear is the spirit of C92 is to have an approach that is focused on auto-determination of the communities. I could really tell you everything that we're doing throughout the country, but it includes activities that are not generally thought of to be funded in something in the framework of Indigenous programs. It could be social intervention, it could be recreation, it could be support workers. I'm giving you examples, but it's really all sorts of things that can exist. Intervention could also include language courses. By nature, these have to reflect the needs of the community and be achieved through auto-determination as
from the Canadian
planned for by this bill C92.
You talked about it being 30 years that you've been battling for this kind of at least acknowledgement, and it's been 14 years, I think, since the Human Rights Tribunal case was first launched. An entire generation of kids has been harmed just since then. Can you talk about the frustration of how long this has taken and why you seem to have more hope today that this is going to reach an actual conclusion?
Well, I thank you for the question. You know, we've been at this now absolutely for 30 years. You know, many of the leaders before myself, many leaders that have come and gone, many of our like I had mentioned, our previous national chiefs, we've been fighting for, you know, equality in this country. You know, after residential schools, after the 60s scoop, you know, after Indian Day School and all these things. And I'm glad that this government is finally listening to some of the things that we're asking them to try and fix with us, and also to to give us the tools that we need as First Nations to be in the driver's seat, because for far too long, it's been patriarchal on our people. And that has to stop. That colonial thinking has to stop. And it has to, the solutions on many of these issues are right in our communities, with our elders, with our people, with our youth, with our leadership, and with our people in our communities. We have the solutions. And we just, we need to not be held back with doing things, going back to our original, the original ways that we used to do things as families, and not just taking from us. Thank you.
I'm not sure who will be the best to answer this, but Minister Miller, you mentioned that nobody really wants to fight this in court or feels like litigation is the best way, except until now that has been the only way the government has been dealing with this. Is the government then withdrawing its appeal, and is it committing to not challenge these in court any further?
And I think the second part of that question is best handled by Minister Lametti, who's with us here today. But I would say this. As mentioned by David Stearns, this is the culmination of three class actions that are overlapping to some extent, and a groundmark decision by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that accorded $40,000 to each removed child. But it is a much broader class than that. And so I'm not going to bore everyone with the inner workings of Cabinet and the decision-making process that freed up about $40 billion. It is quite an intricate one, but today is really about the kids, and we have to remember that at every step of the way. But when the Prime Minister gave us our mandates and said, solve this, three other class actions popped up. So that is not without some complexity. For the last 2 years, our teams have been working together to come up with a model that doesn't re-traumatize children, some very young, as they achieve this compensation that we've been dedicated towards. So it has been a complicated process, and parties have been working together. But the last 6 weeks, when we looked and said to ourselves, do we cease the appeal, and what happens if that happens? Well, a couple things do happen. People do achieve some measure of compensation, notably the children and classes affected by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. But that is far from the end of the story. You've got classes going back to 1990 that have been subjected to the same horrors, and you don't achieve the next step in it, which is ending the discrimination. And it's why, and I won't put words in her mouth, it's why Dr. Blackstock had the courage to trust a government that she had no reason to trust, and sit down with us for 6 weeks, along with AFN, who had no particular reason to trust us either, along with the Chiefs of Ontario, along with Anishinaabe Nation, and say, what are we looking at? What are we trying to solve for? We're trying to solve historic compensation for people that we've said deserve historic compensation. We're also trying to fix the system so that as soon as the appeal is dropped, we're not in court again with the same set of issues. And so on that note, the Prime Minister has been intimately involved in this, and the Minister Hajdu and I have been briefing him every step of the way. He said this has to end. And so we came up with, we gave a mandate to our teams to say, let's get this done and sit down at the table. And these have been very, very difficult conversations, and there are some that do remain. But when I say we have to look at this in a comprehensive way, we could have just ended the appeal and we would have been in court the next day. And that's the point here, is we are moving forward on fixing a broken system. There's $20 billion to do that. It's in a 40-page document, and we're moving towards a comprehensive settle agreement for a whole class of people that were affected by a discriminatory system. And I think that's important to remember today. I think Minister Lametti can speak more about at what stage the abeyance of the current appeal is at.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for allowing me to participate today in this historic day. And thanks to all the leadership groups that are here and representing your peoples. And as Minister Miller said, as others have said, we did this for the kids. You've seen the complexity of these various cases in different legal fora, the Human Rights Tribunal, as well as in class actions, as well as trying to fix the problem moving forward. So we're committed. We committed ourselves to settling this at the negotiating table, where we could get a proactive solution moving forward that compensates as well as helps try to fix this for the future. And so for that reason, when we do get a final agreement, it is our intention to drop the appeal. It is first in front of the federal court and then getting an order from the CHRT that we have met their compensation orders. So that is our intention. And in the meanwhile, the abeyance will move to keep the abeyance in order until that final order. And I think all parties agree to that because, and I know that Dr. Blackstock has said this as well, it is something that is out there until we get a final agreement. And then once we get the final agreement, it is our intention to drop it.
And Olivia Stefanovich, CBC News. I realize some of the details still have to be sorted out, but can you guarantee that each child and family will receive $40,000 each at least, that no one will receive less than that? And how much are lawyers expected to get? How much are the legal fees expected to be?
Well, maybe I can tackle some of that, and then we do have some lawyers on the line that might want to speak about their work. But I will just say this. Our understanding is that, and our expectation is that $40,000 is the floor, and there may be circumstances where people are entitled to more. Again, with the acknowledgement, and having been someone who's, who comes from Thunder Bay, like Deputy Grand Chief Bobby Narcisse, and has interacted with many Indigenous families affected by a system that has been cruel and has been discriminatory, knowing that $40,000 is not enough to make someone whole, but it certainly is a step in the right direction of acknowledging the harm that's been experienced by individuals. I maybe will turn to the legal folks on that are representing the class action that can speak to legal fees.
Right. As I mentioned before, none of the money that's being allocated towards compensation, that is to say the $20 billion, is going to cover legal fees or the administrative costs of the settlement. Those will be determined over and above. And the way class actions work is we'll either come to an agreement with Canada on the amount of legal fees and then submit that to the federal court for approval. The federal court has to approve legal fees as being fair and reasonable. If we can't come to an agreement, we argue it in front of the court, and the court will decide what the legal fees should be. So to answer your question simply, there's no amount that I can tell you in terms of what will be paid for legal fees, because we don't know. We'll either agree to that, submit it to the court, ask them to approve it, or we won't agree to it, and we will argue it in front of the court, and the court will determine in a public hearing what is fair and reasonable for legal fees that are being done on a contingency basis. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. And how confident are you that another generation of First Nations children won't be discriminated against by the federal government?
Well, I think this sets the foundation nicely to end the discrimination and racism, but it isn't without a lot of hard work on behalf of everyone. Because, of course, harms are intergenerational, and communities, I think Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse talked about the challenges in particular, for example, in remote communities in terms of accessing services and having supports. It's interconnected with other discriminatory practices and other lack of funding experiences that First Nations communities have live with every single day. And so our job as federal politicians is to continue to fight for equity in all of the systems that serve Indigenous people. And again, I will repeat that it's not just good for Indigenous people. It's good for the country, the future of this country, when every single person has a fair chance to succeed.
Bonjour, Boris Proulx, Le Devoir. Ma
Boris Proulx from Le Devoir. My question is for Minister Miller.
We
understand that the agreement needs to be finalized by the Human Rights Tribunal. Do we have an idea of how long this will take and how long before people receive money in their pockets? Answer. What we'd like to see is to see things happen as soon as possible. There's a process unfolding between now and March 31st between the parties. We want to make sure that we have a finalized agreement. We're talking about a lot of paperwork, a lot of agreements in principle that have been agreed upon between the parties, but there's still work to be done. There's a lot of paperwork left to be done. We need to arrive at a final version of the document, submit it to the court, and then finalize the long-term reform. So overall, we're talking about a process that will be spread over the next year. There's one critical moment on March 31st. That's the deadline to depose the final document. So there's a lot of work and negotiation that will happen between now and then over the next 3 months. With regards to compensation for the affected people, Mr. Spurn said it quite eloquently. There are discussions that remain to be had between the people, but we want people to see money in their pockets as soon as possible. But again, this is a process that will unfold over the next year. Question. So about the next part, the long-term reform to solve systemic issues, you were talking about C-92 that's been contested by Quebec. Will this be an impediment to your projects? Well, it certainly doesn't help. It's not just Quebec that has issues with C-92. They've taken us to court. They are contesting our authority or jurisdiction. But know that C-92 is an act that speaks to the right of autodetermination or of Indigenous people. So whether I don't like that provincial governments are trying to put this on the backs of Indigenous peoples. So what this is doing is leveling the playing field by setting a minimum investment through reform. So we're putting in conditions to allow C-92 to move forward. We're talking about fighting poverty, about prevention, intervention. Minister Hajdu mentioned this earlier. Discrimination takes many forms. There's discrimination that was done by the federal government. That's what we're talking about today, but every child that is being removed today is being removed by a provincial institution. So there's a lot of mess to clean up. This is the start of what C-92 was aiming to do. The right of self-determination is something that we almost tend to take for granted to protect our children. But there's many things we're trying to do. The federal government is doing its job. It's investing in the communities, investing in reform to stop the harms that are being perpetrated against young people in Indigenous communities. 50% of children in child services are Indigenous, even though they only represent 7% of the population, and this has to stop.
Fraser for APN National News. So this is for the children covered under the class action lawsuits. It sounds quite likely like they would be potentially much larger than $40,000 just for essential services denied, things like that. Is there, well, I guess a couple questions. Any idea how, from the lawyers on these files, how much that compensation may be for these individuals, and does the government want to put a cap on that?
I'm going to suggest that Rob Kugler answer that question. And but I can just say to your last point, the cap is $20 billion. There's no other cap. That is entirely up to the plaintiffs in consultation with experts, communities, to determine, but Rob will have more details on that.
Thank you for the question. We intend over the next 3 months to discuss with our partners the appropriate breakdown of this amount of compensation. And $40,000 will be the floor for the children who were removed, but we want to find ways to give significantly more compensation to those who suffered the greatest harm. There's no cap. This will be determined in a model that we will come up with to be approved by the court, and we will come up with a model that minimizes the trauma associated with individuals making claims.
Okay, thank you. And next question is for the Justice Minister. Is one of the things that you're still trying to clarify, maybe by holding the appeal, is what clarify what exactly Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rulings maybe some more specifics on that, I suppose. Is that part of, I remember in the initial, when they stated the appeal, that was a concern, I think, in the documentation. And so are you looking for a bit more maybe clarity on that? Maybe there could be some fear by the government of having a very broad understanding of these tribunal rulings, and it could open up lots of compensation claims.
Look, thank you for the question. We're not trying to do that here. We're here for the kids. We're here to solve the compensation questions at the negotiating table in a way that covers everybody, in a way that covers both the removed kids and the Jordan's principal classes of kids, because this is the just way to do it. This is the only way I think we can all frankly sleep at night and move this forward to achieve justice. So we're not trying. We felt we had legitimate claims in the court processes, but we decided as a government in consultation with the various Indigenous leadership groups you see before us, that the best way to move forward was trying to settle this. And so we're here to settle it. Today's about the kids. Whatever might happen down the road, ongoing reform or whatever with the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, that's a question for another day. But today we're here for the kids, and we're here only for the kids.
Okay, operator, I think we're trying for 3 to 4 people. I think we can hopefully get through before we run out of time. So please take it away to the first person on the phone.
Thank you. The first question is from Christy Kirkup from the Globe and Mail. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. With all due respect, as you note, the federal government took a very clear position in court on the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case for a very long period of time. And I'm just wondering, what role did public shame play in reaching these agreements with the parties?
Well, maybe I can attempt to answer, Kirsty, and I'll just say this. This is overdue. And I said when I was first appointed as Minister of Indigenous Services Canada that litigation was serving no one any good. I had the support, of course, of the work of Minister Miller and clearly of the Prime Minister. You cannot come to an arrangement like this if the Prime Minister is not solidly behind a negotiating mandate that is of this size. And so the time to move forward is now. And I think, quite arguably, it could have been earlier, absolutely. I hope that this is a lesson that our country will learn and will learn for once and for all, that discrimination, not only is it, and racism, not only is it extremely painful to the people that are experiencing it and devastating to lives and communities, but it is extremely costly to the federal government. It is also a lost opportunity. I reflect on the names of the individuals that the lawyers spoke about that were willing to put their names to the class action lawsuit. But I think about the many, many people in my own circles prior to politics that I met that had devastating lives and that had devastation in their children's lives as a result of discrimination and racism of this country. I think, we should never have to be pushed again to do the right thing by children of this country. Maybe I can turn to Chief Woodhouse to say a few more words about the work that you've been doing over the number of years.
Absolutely. Thank you, Minister. That's a good question, but I always believe that it's better when we're at the table, as I said a month ago, and it's better when we're at the table, and sometimes they're, as opposed to in court. And I can't go into too much details, but over the last few weeks, it was better that we were at the table talking face to face, having really hard discussions, and pushing each other. I pushed hard, but we have to correct the wrongs that have been happening in this country for far too long for First Nations children, First Nations families, and the elders who are watching this who were horrified. I remember, I didn't want to talk about this, but I'm going to say it, you know. And my mother was telling me that my grandmother didn't like the system. She didn't like, you know, when it was being imposed on our people back in Manitoba, and that the way that it started to crumble and go, and that shouldn't have been the way that we treat our most precious little ones. You know, and sometimes, you know, in Manitoba, where I come from, it's you know, it's become the epicenter of child apprehension in this country, possibly even the world. And that has to stop. We have to keep our children and families together, and we have to give them opportunities to have the best lives that they can. You know, I'm the mother of 2 little boys, and every single day I work hard to make sure that those little boys have a good life, you know, and their father who's here helps me all the time. And every child deserves that in our communities. And sometimes if there's problems or issues, you shouldn't just rip our family apart. You should, you know, people, you know, we shouldn't be discriminated against, you know, based on if there's ever an issue somewhere, even if it's a small issue. We need to work through those and move towards making sure that our families stay intact in our First Nations communities across this country and with their families without, you know, a number on their, you know, the discrimination on their, right on their head as soon as they're born, you know, or the, you know, there's been many issues and public things, even in Winnipeg, where a mother has her child taken right from birth. That has to stop. The birth alerts have to stop across this country, you know. And I know, you know, to the mothers out there waiting to be reunited with your children, and the fathers, don't lose hope. Keep pushing. Keep, you know, we're here, and we're all trying to work together. And these are hard discussions sometimes, but we have to stop. And we have to work together, and we have to have these hard discussions as Canadians, First Nations and Canadians. Thank you.
And just as a follow-up, if I may, also questions for the ministers, but I'm wondering what you've learned as a government that will ensure that discrimination is brought to an end. Today's statement from Indigenous Services acknowledges that there has been discrimination by the government against First Nations kids. So what can you draw from this in terms of lessons?
I'll start, and maybe Minister Miller can add. For me, I'm in politics because I believe that when every person in this country has a fair chance to succeed, our country is stronger. It's been the driving force for me to be a politician. It's, I believe, the driving force for my colleagues who are around the table. I hope the lesson that we're learning, as I said earlier, is that discriminatory funding for Indigenous people in this country is not just harmful and wrong and morally repugnant, but that it is shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of prosperity for the entire country. When Indigenous people see themselves as hopeful and well and participants in their own communities, in the broader economy, in the future of the country, all of us thrive. And so my hope is that this work that we've done with our partners, including, by the way, Anishinaabe Nation on things like northern remote quotients that have far too long been ignored, will be a lesson for the future of the Government of Canada, regardless of who is leading it. Because, of course, this is broader than one party, it's broader than one Prime Minister, but this is a very good foundation to start having conversations and instilling a way forward that is built on a foundation of equity.
Yeah, Christy, I'll answer your first question because I think it's tied to your follow-up. But yeah, 100 years ago, Dr. Bryce was highlighting these practices that saw 25% mortality rates in residential schools. That was shameful, and no one listened to him. There's lots of shameless people in this society. There's a lot of politicians that are shameless. If the truth causes shame, then so be it. And I think, you do, as a politician, feel shame, but you also have to do stuff and try to fix the system. And there's 100 years that have gone by, and in this case, 30 years. And there's plenty of shame to share. But it's been on the backs of Indigenous children that haven't had a fair shot in life because of our practices as a country. I think the reminder for us, for Cabinet, for our government, for any politician, any aspiring politician, any person in Canada, is that in these cases there is a cost to inaction, and we've seen that in the courts, and this is very costly. And when it comes to reconciliation, I think we all have to realize once and for all that you can want reconciliation all you want, but it ain't free. There's a cost to it, but it's an important one. And in this case, it'll allow, it's an important step towards substantive equality.
Can I just add, Christy, quickly to what Minister Miller has said? This isn't an end point. This is a point along the way in what what Chief Abrams described as the two-row wampum. It's going to take a long time to strip away the layers of colonial structures and the layers of systemic discrimination, systemic racism, and ways of thinking that have been brought about by colonial structures. It's got to be our national project to achieve that. This is a positive step along the way, but we need to keep moving forward in every sphere, working together with Indigenous peoples and their leadership in order to get this done.
I'm trying to squeeze two more journalists in. Can we drop the supplementaries and just one question from the last two journalists, and then we'll wrap this up. So, operator, the next person, please.
Certainly. Next question. La prochaine question, Wyatt Sharp from the Wyatt Sharp Show. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi there. I'm just going to ask, I believe it was mentioned at the beginning regarding the eligibility of the compensation and how it's not yet known and how it'll be determined amongst the different parties. So can you, to one of the ministers, can you speak about the eligibility of the compensation, but specifically what factors you would like to see taken into consideration when determining the eligibility of the compensation, specifically for the $20 billion that has been allocated to survivors and families of abuse?
Well, thank you, Wyatt. And first of all, thank you for being a young person interested in covering this story, because I think this is important for all young people to know. And hopefully your young audience is listening. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, this settles a number of class actions, but will provide compensation to hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people who have been affected by discriminatory and racist practices by the Government of Canada, indeed by provinces and territories, in the way that we've supported Indigenous families and communities. It's hard to say right now how many people and how that compensation will be determined. That's the work ahead. And it will be Indigenous-led. It will be First Nations-led, so that First Nations people and communities and leaders can ensure that the compensation is correct and right, and also, I think, importantly, delivered in a way that is safe and not re-traumatizing to people.
Could I just add that if you have questions about eligibility that are known now and that can be answered now, as opposed to those that have yet to be determined, I would ask you to go to the frequently asked questions that I mentioned in my earlier remarks, and I can now give you the link. It is SOTOS Class Actions, SOTOS Class Actions, all one word, .com/FAQ. And that'll give you the best that we can give you right now that'll answer the question of who's in and who's out.
Thank you, merci. Next question is from David Aiken from Global News. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for taking the question. Just let me turn my stuff off here. A very quick question for, I'm going to do double barrel here. Just want to get a sense of the potential number of victims who will be compensated. I think Regional Chief Woodhouse mentioned 200,000. So just someone in Ascension just say yes or no. And a bigger issue, and I'll put this to maybe Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse. Over the years, as I watched many communities in NAN many communities with the Mushkegowuk Council lurch from crisis to crisis, out of Wapaskatchewan, Szechuan, etc. I would ask some leaders, I say, how is it that the Cree communities on the east side of James Bay in Quebec seem to be so much more prosperous than those in the western side of James Bay? And the answer is often, well, take a look at that 1971 agreement the Cree signed, the James Bay Project, that those communities have control over their lands. That gave them the resources to turn themselves around and become healthier communities. So I wonder, as I think about that 1971 agreement, does this agreement, Deputy Grand Chief Narcisse, have the potential to have the same kind of transformative effect on some of the communities in Nan and potentially in Manitoba? Is this that kind of deal that gives leaders in your communities the resources to build healthier communities?
Hello, thank you for that question. And yes, this provides an opportunity for our First Nations within the Anishinaabe Nation territory to really look at the community-based challenges that we have. And it gives an opportunity as a First Nations-led process that they'll have community-based solutions moving ahead. We're talking about, respecting our First Nations jurisdiction over their children wherever they may reside. And how is that going to be reflective in the work that's happening ahead? We have to take into consideration, too, that even within Anishinaabe Nation, we are very diverse. You talked about the Mushkegowuk, we have the Matawa Tribal Council, we have Shipogama, we have Windigo, we have Independence, all various degrees of diversity in terms of some of the challenges. And I think this is an opportunity within the IIP moving ahead, gives an opportunity for all of our regional areas to really determine how Child and Family Services reform is going to happen, how this compensation is going to be allocated. That's the important work that lies ahead. And we'll be taking direction from our individual First Nations in that regard. As NAN, as an advocacy organization, we go by where our First Nation communities direct us. And we are putting in place a opportunity, a process, a protected process where our First Nation communities could help, could also direct and give mandate to how this reform is going to be reflective of the needs of their individual First Nation communities and what is going to be happening in those negotiations as well. So we're, of course, very cautiously optimistic in these talks, but this agreement in principle sets the stage for the opportunities for our First Nation communities to lead those negotiations. This is what we have, this is what we need, and this is what we want in terms of moving forward. So, anyway.
I think Minister Miller did say we seem just when we were speaking just a moment there, they would have time for one more, if I'm correct with that. Was I correct with that? Yes. So and I'm not trying to put you on the spot by saying that. So I think we can do one more solo question, and then we've got to move on.
Thank you. Next question is from Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press. À vous la parole. Please go ahead.
Hi there. Mr. Stearns, could you please break down the number of people that might be eligible for compensation? Chief Woodhouse mentioned that we could be looking at more than 200,000 people between the two groups. So I'm wondering if you have any provincial or territorial breakdown, and if you have any sense of how many fit into the Jordan's Principal group versus those in the Apprehension group.
I'm going to turn that one over to Mr. Kugler.
Thank you for the question. So we, together with Canada, hired experts to help us get a proper estimate of how many children are affected. And for the subclass of children removed from their homes since 1991, our experts have given us the opinion that we are looking at 115,000 children. And that's the enormity of this case. 115,000 children separated from their families as a result of a system that finally is being reformed. With respect to Jordan's Principle, it's a bit more challenging to come up with a figure. However, based on the data that is available, since 2007, we are looking at approximately 60,000 individuals, and we need to extrapolate that data going back to 1991. So it's likely more than 100,000 children affected by the principles underlying what is now known as Jordan's Principle. So if you take that amount, which you have more than 100,000, plus the 115,000 children removed from their homes, you're at in excess of 215,000 already. And that doesn't include the family members of those children. So we have estimated several 100,000. We can't be more specific than that at this point in time. And to your specific question of whether there is a breakdown by province, we do not have that information at this time. All we can say is this class action settlement, if it is approved by the federal court, will enable all children removed from their families to benefit no matter where in Canada they are from.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.